Hi there. This is Sylvia Shults, your host for Lights Out. I'm so glad you could join me today. There is a theory in reincarnation circles that if someone has a more than passing interest in a certain period in history, there's a better than average chance that they've spent a previous lifetime, or 2, or 3, or a dozen, in that era. If this is true, then I'm quite sure I've spent several lifetimes in ancient Egypt. I have been obsessed with the ancient world all my life, and Egypt has always held a special place in my heart. So it was with a real sense of excitement that I discovered a few really, really gross stories. Not necessarily ghost stories, but tales of ancient deaths and age-old curses and crumbly, dusty mummies. I take a great deal of pleasure in sharing some of those tales with you in this episode. So grab your torches, duck into the narrow tomb passageway with me, and let's go lights out. One of the very first Chicago ghost stories my father told me, back in the heyday of my Egypt obsession, so I was like 10, was the tale of the screaming mummy at the Field Museum. Sometime in the 1930s, the story goes, a museum guard was making his nighttime rounds when he heard blood-curdling shrieks coming from the Egyptian exhibit. Back then, it was just one big room, not the brilliant tomb and marketplace setup they have now. Anyway, the guard raced for the exhibit, thinking that some poor museum-goer had somehow gotten locked in, and had found themselves surrounded by the ancient dead and was currently freaking out. But when the guard reached the Egyptian wing, there was no one there. But one of the mummies had fallen off its slanted display board and was lying face down next to it in its case. When this story is told, many times the screaming mummy is said to have been the mummy of Harwa, the doorkeeper of the Temple of Amun, which has been in the museum's collection since 1904. However, as Adam Selzer points out in his Mysterious Chicago blog at mysteriouschicagoblog.com, this may not be true. He says that the earliest known mention of the incident, a bulletin from the museum reprinting an earlier piece by Henry Field from 1953, says that the mummy was naked and Harwa is still completely wrapped, except for his head. Now, the thing that freaked me out the most when I first heard this story, creeps me out to this day as a matter of fact, is that no one, no matter how determined they were to cause mischief, could have gotten into that case to tip the mummy off its slant board. You see, the display cases are filled with nitrogen gas to keep bugs from attacking the ancient bodies. In order to go in and replace the mummy, curators had to pump the poisonous gas out before they could even go in and set things right. Freaked me out then, freaks me out now. One of the best gross-out stories I read concerning ancient Egypt was actually not in a history book. It was in a book about honey. The Roman writer Columella repeatedly mentions the use of honey in embalming bodies. Honey is a fabulous preservative, as it tends to drive moisture away from tissues while still keeping them supple. Imagine a piece of fruit soaked in honey, pliable, sweet, and delicious. The Greek philosopher Democritus was preserved in honey, and the Arab writer Abd al-Latif relates that some Bedouins were out in the desert near the pyramids one day, looking for treasure in the nearby tombs. In the shifting sands, they discovered a sealed jar, which turned out to be full of honey. The travelers dipped their bread into it for a midday snack. As they started eating, one of the men noticed a hair in the honey he'd smeared on his bread. The men dumped the honey out of the jug, and out slid the corpse of a small child in a perfect state of preservation. The tiny body was richly adorned with jewels, but I'd be willing to bet that was cold comfort to the poor schmo who had already taken a bite of his honey-smeared bread. In 1976, when I was 8 years old, the treasures of Tutankhamun went on tour from the Cairo Museum. Even before then, I was entranced by the story of the boy king, his short life, the discovery of his all but forgotten tomb, and the gold. Everywhere the glint of gold. I recently read a wonderful book by Daniel Meyerson called In the Valley of the Kings, Howard Carter and the Mystery of King Tutankhamun's Tomb. The book was all about the years leading up to the discovery of the tomb, and the personalities with which Howard Carter had to contend. One of these characters was a man named Arthur Weigall. He was one of the inspectors at the Valley of the Kings, and he chronicled his adventures in Egypt in many essays. These stories both come from the early part of the 20th century, a time when rich patrons paid for each season's worth of digging in the desert in search of the treasures of the pharaohs. One of these men was Lord Carnarvon, who financed Carter's digging for many years. In 1922, Carter would discover King Tutankhamun's tomb. But in 1905, that exciting moment was well in both Carter's and Carnarvon's future. Although Carnarvon had hired a large band of workers and basket boys, anyone could tell that he was an amateur. Digging first in one spot and then suddenly switching to another, he proceeded erratically, without any method to his madness. Or so it seemed. A casual observer of this new farce in the desert had no way of knowing that though no archaeologist directed Carnarvon's excavation, the Earl was getting advice from a more reliable source, the ancient priests themselves, who whispered their messages to him through his psychics and supernormalists. The result was that after Carnarvon's first season was over and the dust had settled, what he had to show for his work was, well, a mummified cat. An unimpressive find, perhaps, weighed on the scales of the uninitiated. But if we consider the account of Arthur Weigall, the new inspector, then Carnarvon's first discovery might be seen as a portent of things to come, a find in keeping with the Earl's mystical propensities and psychic energy. Lord Carnarvon discovered a hollow wooden figure of a large black cat, which we recognized to be the shell in which a real embalmed cat was confined. The figure looked more like a small tiger as it sat in the sunlight at the edge of the pit in which it had been discovered, glaring at us with its yellow-painted eyes. Its body was covered all over with a thick coating of smooth, shining pitch, and we could not at first detect the line along which the shell had been closed after it had received the mortal remains of the sacred animal within. But we knew from experience that the joint passed completely round the figure, from the nose over the top of the head, down the back, and along the breast, so that, when opened, the two sides would fall apart in equal halves. The somber figure was carried down to the Nile and across the river to my house, where, by a mistake on the part of my Egyptian servant, it was deposited in my bedroom. Returning home at the dead of night, I here found it seated in the middle of the floor, directly in my path from the door to the matches, and for some moments I was constrained to sit beside it, rubbing my shins. I rang the bell, but receiving no answer, I walked to the kitchen, where I found the servants grouped distractedly around the butler, who had been stung by a scorpion, and was in the throes of that short but intense agony. Soon he passed into a state of delirium, and believed himself to be pursued by a large grey cat, a fancy which did not surprise me, since he had so lately assisted in carrying the figure to its ill-chosen resting place in my bedroom. At length I retired to bed, but the moonlight which now entered the room through the open French windows fell full upon the black figure of the cat, and for some time I lay awake, watching the peculiarly weird creature as it stared past me at the wall. I estimated its age to be considerably more than 3,000 years, and I tried to picture to myself the strange people who, in those distant times, had fashioned this curious coffin for a cat which had been to them half pet and half household god. In the distance I could hear the melancholy wails of the unfortunate butler imploring those around him to keep the cat away from him, and it seemed to me that there came a glitter into the eyes of the figure as the low cries echoed down the passage. At last I fell asleep, and for about an hour all was still. Then, suddenly, a report like that of a pistol rang through the room. I started up, and as I did so, a large gray cat sprang either from or onto the bed, leapt across my knees, dug its claws into my hands, and dashed through the window into the garden. At the same moment, I saw by the light of the moon that the two sides of the wooden figure had fallen apart and were rocking themselves to a standstill upon the floor, like two great empty shells. Between them sat the mummified figure of a cat, the bandages which swathed it around being ripped open at the neck, as though they had been burst outward. I sprang out of bed and rapidly examined the divided shell, and it seemed to me that the humidity in the air here on the bank of the Nile had expanded the wood which had rested in the dry desert so long, and had caused the two halves to burst apart with the loud noise which I had heard. Then, going to the window, I scanned the moonlit garden, and there, in the middle of the pathway, I saw not the gray cat which had scratched me, but my own pet tabby, standing with arched back and bristling fur, glaring into the bushes, as though she saw 10 feline devils therein. I will leave the reader to decide whether the great cat was the malevolent spirit which had burst its way through the bandages and woodwork and had fled into the darkness, or whether the torn embalming cloths represented the natural destructive work of time, and the grey cat was a night wanderer which had strayed into my room and had been frightened by the easily explained bursting apart of the two sides of the ancient Egyptian figure. In an essay entitled The Malevolence of Ancient Spirits, Arthur Weigall catalogued a long list of strange incidents, of mummies being removed from houses where desperately sick children then recover, of mummified animals bursting as their live counterparts suddenly appeared nearby, and so on. Incidents that the skeptical may dismiss as coincidence or hearsay. One story, however, was especially noteworthy, and that it needs no supernatural sanction. With or without sorcery, it reveals the way the daily work of the diggers had the potential to induce a kind of madness. We were engaged in clearing out a vertical tomb shaft, Weigall recalled, which had been cut through the rock underlying the sandy surface of the desert. At sunset I gave the order to stop work for the night, and I was about to set out on my walk back to the camp, when the foreman came to tell me that a mummied hand had been laid bare, and it was evident that we were about to come upon an interred body. By lamplight, therefore, the work was continued, and presently we had uncovered the sand-dried body of an old woman, who, by her posture, appeared to have met with a violent death. It was evident that this did not represent the original burial in the tomb, the bottom of the shaft not yet having been reached, and I conjectured that the corpse before us had been thrown from above at some more recent date, perhaps in Roman times, when the shaft was but half full of debris, and in course of time had become buried by blown sand and natural falls of rock. The workmen were now waiting for their evening meal, but I was anxious to examine the body and its surroundings carefully. I therefore sent all but one of the men back to the camp, and descended into the shaft by means of a rope ladder, carrying with me a hurricane lamp to light my search. In the flickering rays of the lamp, the old woman lay upon her back, her arms outstretched upward, as though they had stiffened thus in some convulsion, the fingers being locked together. Her legs were thrust outwards rigidly, and the toes were cramped and bent. The features of the face were well preserved, as was the whole body, and long black hair descended to her bony shoulders in a tangled mass. Her mouth was wide open, the 2 rows of teeth gleaming savagely in the uncertain light, and the hollow eye sockets seemed to stare upwards as though fixed upon some object of horror. Despite the passage of thousands of years, the faces of mummies are often extraordinarily expressive. One has only to compare the peaceful, dignified expression on the face of Seti I with the agonized features of Pharaoh Seqenenre, who died of horrible wounds in battle. Just as I was completing my search, I felt a few drops of rain fall, and at the same time realized that the wind was howling and whistling above me. A rainstorm in Upper Egypt is a very rare occurrence, and generally it is of a torrential character. If I left the body at the bottom of the shaft, I thought to myself, it would be soaked and destroyed. And since, as a specimen, it was well worth preserving, I decided to carry it to the surface, where there was a hut in which it could be sheltered. I called out to the man whom I had told to wait for me on the surface, but received no reply. Either he had misunderstood me and gone home, or else the noise of the wind prevented my voice from reaching him. Large spots of rain were now falling, and there was no time for hesitation. I therefore lifted the body onto my back, the two outstretched arms passing over my shoulders, and the linked fingers clutching, as it were, at my chest. I then began to climb up the rope ladder, and as I did so, I noticed with something of a qualm that the old woman's face was peeping at me over my right shoulder, and her teeth seemed about to bite my right ear. I had climbed about half the distance when my foot dislodged a fragment of rock from the side of the shaft, and, as luck would have it, the stone fell right upon the lamp, smashing the glass and putting the light out. The darkness in which I found myself was intense, and now the wind began to buffet me and to hurl the sand into my face. With my right hand, I felt for the woman's head and shoulder in order to hitch the body more firmly onto my back, but to my surprise, my hand found nothing there. At the same moment, I became conscious that the hideous face was grinning at me over my left shoulder, my movements, I suppose, having shifted it. And without further delay, I blundered and scrambled to the top of the shaft in a kind of panic. No sooner had I reached the surface than I attempted to relieve myself of my burden. The wind was now screaming past me, and the rain was falling fast. I put my left hand up to catch hold of the corpse's shoulder, and to my dismay found that the head had slipped round once more to my right, and the face was peeping at me from that side. I tried to remove the arms from around my neck, but, with ever-increasing horror, I found that the fingers had caught in my coat and seemed to be holding on to me. A few moments of struggle ensued, and at last the fingers released their grip. Thereupon the body swung round, so that we stood face to face, the withered arms still around my neck, and the teeth grinning at me through the darkness. A moment later I was free, and the body fell back from me, hovered a moment, as it were, in mid-air, and suddenly disappeared from sight. It was then that I realized that we had been struggling at the very edge of the shaft, down which the old woman had now fallen, and near which some will say that she had been wildly detaining me. Yeah, I can tell you for sure that I would not have been as calm and collected as Arthur Weigall in that situation. Being half-strangled by an old lady mummy? No, thank you. I hope you've enjoyed this peek into the past. Even though there weren't any actual ghosts in this show, I do hope I did a good job of creeping you out. If you did enjoy this show, I encourage you to seek out my book, Timeless Embrace. It's a collection of 4 romance novellas, taking a look at the 3 ancient cultures, Egypt, Greece, and Rome. There's also a mythology story thrown in there just for funsies. It's a nice change of pace, and if you like humorous romance, you might want to check it out. Visit sylviashults.com for details. Join us next time. We will return to haunted asylums when we next go Lights Out.